Good evening. This is Sunday, August 4th, 2019. This is Gail Lloyd, and this is my testimonial about how I became a targeted individual and how the police across this nation have acted criminally towards me ever since I gained that unfortunate status. And I want to begin by saying that this all started for me in 2008, and now, 11 years later, I still am caught by minions of the deep state who assault me daily. They hire young thugs. I have overheard these thugs who infest rooms beneath the floorboards of houses or apartments that I rent, and they shoot electrochemical weapons at me. And more than once I've heard them tell me that police officers, a cop trained me to do this, quote unquote, to be precise. And even though, like many of us who have wild and impetuous younger years where, I struggled with addictions, I never had criminal intent or intent to harm anybody. And so I had recently posted a testimonial of all that had transpired in regards to my dealings with the police from 2008 up until current time, and mysteriously it vanished off my Facebook wall. So clearly that's censorship going on, and so I'm trying this once again. Hopefully YouTube isn't playing the censorship game to the extent that Facebook is yet anyway. And I don't know if you can see my face. I have been assaulted quite heavily today all over my body, and the gray there is bentonite clay because they've been shooting me with electrochemical weapons in the eye, like I said, from beneath the floorboards of this apartment. And you can see rashing and discoloration of my skin. I know sometimes it gets a little lossy once you upload a video to YouTube, so I hope you guys can see that. And so basically, I'm not a criminal. I don't deserve in any way to be treated like a criminal. And what I am is somebody who, through my artistry, I was a singer-songwriter, a co-owner in an independent record label for most of my adult life, or broad stretch, almost 2 decades, in Nashville, Tennessee, touring all over the world, having my music played on radio shows, getting reviewed in periodicals all over the world, and performing in everything from pubs and bingo halls up to mega holiday camps where there would be numerous acts and tens of thousands of people in a weekend. And then I outgrew our marriage and I divorced my husband, and for all sorts of reasons I became sort of a modern day witch hunt by a lot of techies. And some of it had to do with animosity from the entrenched music mafia, who really resented an upstart little indie record label doing an end around their corporate edifices, because we were singing and songwriting, and hiring local brilliant musicians in the community, making our own records, manufacturing them through other little indie companies, and we just completely shut out the necessity to be dependent on these corporate structures, who really were becoming a sort of a meat grinder for extremely talented folks who were sold a bill of goods and told they were going to make a lot of money, and then if they didn't make 1 million records, they basically owed a debt to the label after all the money shilled out for fancy concerts and limo rides, etc., etc. And then I was also a very flashy performer. I was very charismatic on stage, and I really became fascinated with the whole genre of rockabilly and jump blues. And so that was sort of challenging the Southern culture down there, especially the rockabilly scene resented female performers at the time I started getting into that. And so there was just a lot of hostility for me doing this. A woman born and raised in Hawaii who, actually I'm more southern than Alabama, but none of them picked up on that, unfortunately. If you look at the latitude Hawaii is on, I'm actually deep south, born and raised. So back to the situation as it was fomenting in Hawaii. I was very outspoken. Both my husband and I were very outspoken politically on the more Democrat progressive side of the spectrum. And again, that was angering the sort of good old boy mafia establishment there. And years later, I learned that actually at that time, Nashville had become a big hub for human trafficking. And so I was very frustrated, a very dysfunctional marriage, but in those final years, and I had a couple of affairs, and so I was completely on the outs with my husband's coterie, because he was hiring all these guys that needed a job, and they had their own sort of good old boy franchise they had established over the years. So I was very vulnerable. So it became like blood in the water. I tried to continue performing live locally and was really either mocked or hit on by shady characters, and I became increasingly isolated. And then I realized, courtesy of the George Bush Patriot Act, that I was being surveilled and my privacy horrifically violated in every way possible. And this came about because basically the Patriot Act said that anyone you have a grudge against, if you're in media, you can harness all the state-of-the-art military and mafia technologies to hunt them and lynch them any way you want. And so that empowered the sex traffickers, the sexual abusers, the narcissists, the mafia in Nashville, and it just metastasized. And I don't know if it was kismet or what with me, but I became a prime target. And my home started getting invaded, and gaslighting happening in the community wherever I went, all sorts of emotional mind games. I was physically stalked wherever I went. And a few times I detected a gas either in my apartment or in a motel room my final weeks in Nashville that put me in an altered state. And actually, it seemed to lower one's inhibition and increase sort of feelings of sexual arousal. And I, putting it together two and two, realized that they were trying to make me into some sort of a prostitute for them, or remotely viewed sexual trafficking victim, something like that. And partially what really escalated me were a couple into this horrific, lurid new limelight was when I had already, through association with my husband, established this network of free-thinking, independent media all over the world that were scrambling to try to figure out, how to unite and contend against this new escalation of Mordor brought forth by the Patriot Act. And so there were a lot of people that, had their eye on me through the scandal of my divorce. And I made the decision, rather than run, which probably would have been the smarter thing to do, but I really was on the outs with my family back in Hawaii as well, because they really liked my husband. And so I really didn't have a support group to run to. And so instead I blew the whistle on them in social media and started just journaling about what was happening to me and started doing research about it. And NPR had, and they still do, this little cubicle that you go into, and what's it called? It'll come to me eventually, but they'll interview you on any story you want, and then it'll be in their archives that they can pull out at any time they want it. So I was just looking for every opportunity I could to just get the word out about what this evil was that was happening to me. And it seemed very entrenched in the good old boy matrix there, so I was afraid to go to the police. And finally, I noticed this police officer parked in a parking lot at a corner about a block away from my house, and he was having a conversation with the pastor there. And so I got up my courage and I went over to him and I said, can you please help me? My life is being taken over by this hacking surveillance ring. And I know that and I was so ignorant and naive about how this whole surveillance thing worked at the time. I thought it was like bugs in the wall. I didn't even know that you could be looked at through your computer screen. That's how ignorant I was. And so he said, whoa, you are in luck. You came to the right guy. I just happen to be the head of this team of pro-busting hackers. And I went down to South America and I busted a mafia ring there, and I am your man. I'll go and look through your house and see if I can find any bugs and see if I can find ways to shore up a firewall for your computer. And I was like, oh my gosh, what a relief. I was so relieved. And so what proceeded over the next 3 weeks or so is, he came by the initial time and checked, and said he couldn't find anything, and he checked out my computer, and the games kept being played, and, it was made clear that, somebody could remotely operate my computer as if they were sitting there with their hands on the keyboards right next to mine, and he couldn't find a thing wrong. And so then there came a time when I called to ask him to help me again, and he said, I'm going on this very top secret mission, and I'm going to be out of phone reach. So just call the police department and they can help you, but I'm going to be incognito for a while. And I was like, all right. And then a couple days later, I got a call in the morning from his wife, very angry and suspicious, and she said to me, why is your number on my husband's personal phone? And I was like, I don't know. I asked a police officer, and I went in and explained the whole thing to her, and she said, no, he's not a specialist for any, cyber hacking, busting group. He's not on a secret mission anywhere. And as we continued our conversation, both of us, it dawned on us that he had lied to me about everything. So that was my first attempt to ask for police support in Nashville. And I did call a couple I called the police department again, and a couple of very nice officers came over and were very understanding, offered me no help whatsoever, but one of them said, I had a stalker once too, and it was very troubling, and I feel sorry for you. So that was the one brief interlude of, at least they were kind and compassionate and respectful. Okay, so then at some point, it was about 6 months of this going on, I just realized I was just in over my head. And so I ran for my life. My aunt on the West Coast in Oregon offered me safe haven in her home, where I went and stayed for a year, and I worked for Oregon State Public Interest Research Group, which is a community support organization and helping people not in just that community, but all over the nation on consumer protection issues, environmental issues, etc., where I was at a call bank. And the hassling continued. There were a lot of shady characters. It was a very high stress work, so there was a lot of turnover, and it wasn't well paid, so you got a lot of kind of borderline shady people funneling through that were harassing and gaslighting me as I sat at my computer, and also hacking into the computer and changing words into cuss words, or just kind of little innuendos to let me know that the spying and surveillance was continuing, the mockery and the humiliation. And eventually I had to move out of my aunt's house after a year, and so when I moved into apartments again, my apartments would be violated, and disgusting things like blood or other bodily fluids wiped on furniture, etc. And at one point, after 4 years of trying to take a stand in Portland, one of my coworkers, he was a very young fellow, and I kind of took him under my wing because he was being harassed by people in the office as well. And he was afraid of this union that had formed in the office, and they were bullying and harassing him. And one day he said, I'm afraid they're going to invade my home and do something terrible to me. I'm really scared. And I said, just keep talking to the managers and sharing your feelings, and so that they can have your back. And then the next morning he came in white as a sheet, and he said somebody actually drove up on the pavement and hit him with their car and drove off. And he wasn't injured, but he was terrified. And that was it for me. I was like, I just can't, I can't deal with this anymore. And so I then asked my father if I could stay with him for a while back in Hawaii on the island of Oahu, and I fled there, where I attempted to try once again to escape this horrific new development in our society. And at first it was all right. He was a little bit neglected, and so I did a lot of work cleaning up his condominium and oiling the cracked dry furniture and getting the layer of dust off the bookshelves, and organizing his formidable piles of refuse and papers and stuff into some kind of order. And so for a while it was nice to have kind of an adult relationship with the elder parent, because I hadn't lived in Hawaii until I had moved away when I was 18 and hadn't lived in Hawaii since. And at that time I was just kind of being low key. I a lot of times was house and pet sitting, really studying with a lot of thought leaders and enlightenment coaches, business coaches, entrepreneurial coaches, through teleseminars online, and participating in some writing programs. And I actually got a chapter in a book that became #1 on Amazon called Wounded Survive Thrive, and it was 100 women just talking about their stories of how they overcame overwhelming adversity and were stronger for it. And then I think it was when I was encouraged by one coaching author to start writing a memoir, and also I got on with a screenplay coach, and so I started piecing together what had taken place for me, and I think that brought the Eye of Mordor back onto me. And pretty soon, the gaslighting started again. At one point, my passport and birth certificate were stolen out of the little jewelry box that I kept in my bathroom in my father's condominium. And so I called the police, and they said they'd send a detective over to interview me, get a written statement, and kind of inspect to see how somebody could have broken in. And so when that officer arrived, he handed me the form, and I was sitting at the dining table, and he literally hovered over me within inches of me, and interrogated me as I tried to write the written report. And he sounded very aggressive. He sounded like I was the criminal, or I was just some crazy person and I made the whole thing up for attention. And so as I'm writing, I'm getting more and more disoriented. It's getting harder for me to see clearly, and my handwriting and sentence structure became more challenging to look legible. And I realized that he had some chemical on him, and he not only was he gaslighting me, but he was literally gassing me to try to make me mess up on that report. So I managed to get through it, and he looked around, and again, it was like nothing's wrong here. I don't see anything problems here, and and so in the ensuing weeks, I started to detect horrible, horrible burning, powdery substance in my bedding, in my undergarments, clothing, and car that would cause blisters, rashes, contusions, and it was so hard to wash off. And when it got in my underwear, it would go right up into my uterus, and at one point it actually sterilized me, and my period stopped. And so I started collecting evidence, clothing and jewelry items that had this chemical on them, and I brought them to a local police station, and again wrote out a report. This time the officer sitting next to me didn't have a chemical on him. He seemed very nice. He accepted my evidence, and he gave me an ID number for that evidence, and he said, just keep collecting it, and anything new, feel free to just come back and pull your evidence and add to it to build your case. And so a couple weeks later, I had accumulated more evidence, and I was directed to, this time, the city, the capital city of Honolulu Police Department, because that's where the evidence and records were kept. And when I showed up there, I was informed that the evidence was missing. And so I went back to that local police station, and I demanded to see the officer who had received my evidence. And I sat there for about 2 hours, and eventually he pulled up in his car, and he stepped out, and there was my evidence in his hands. And his explanation was that he was keeping it safe in his house, and he was informed by his boss, I guess, that he wasn't allowed to receive it in the first place. And I threw up my hands in the air, and I was like, what am I supposed to do? My life is being threatened by this terrible stuff happening to me. And he said I should hire a private detective and share the evidence with him, and that way you can build a real case here. And so I did some homework, and I found who seemed to be one of the most prestigious forensic specialists. I won't say his name because later he sounded very scared of who was doing this to me. And so, for almost $400, I spent an hour laying out my evidence, and passed the check to him. At the end of that hour, he slid the check back over to me, and he said, I tell you what, Gail, and he made it very clear, he had seen this happen before. My first phone call with him, he said, when this had happened before, it ended in a death. And he said during that meeting, I know what's happening to you, and if I were somebody of less integrity, I could take your money, and it would take thousands and thousands of dollars to build a case for you with this evidence at hand. And I'm telling you right now, you cannot win. You cannot win with who you're up against. And he said that community where your father's condominium is, there's some really terrible stuff going down, and you need to run for your life. And, not what I wanted to hear. And I said, what am I going to do? And he said, I suggest you pray. That's a scientist telling me that, one of the most premier forensic specialists throughout the Pacific. And so I packed up and I ran. And I ran to the Big Island. And at that point, what had happened is that I got trapped into this really sinister military, real estate mafia trafficking ring where, I was in Kona, and when you live there, you mostly find places word of mouth. And there's not a lot of rental opportunities, so it's clear how that circle could get very, in each other's business. And I went through 9 different properties there, where each time when I moved, they all seemed so nice and above board, but it wasn't long before it became clear that if I didn't act like a second wife or a domestic servant, the poisons would show up again in my bedding and clothes and car. And I had gotten a little wiser at detoxing at this point, and so was managing to stay at a certain level of health, and I was really conscious of getting in the ocean a lot and surfing a lot and running and just trying to keep my physical health up, taking a lot of supplements, etc. And but the poisons kept escalating, and then eventually, my last few weeks there, I resorted to staying in a hotel. And that first night, as soon as I came back from grocery shopping, again, the poisons were sprayed all over that hotel room, and it was the worst yet. And I just, went out on the porch and went walking around the gardens thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And there I found a spray bottle kind of hiding under a little ornamental tree. And I thought, is that the smoking gun? And so I called the police. 4 large officers showed up. I said, look at my skin and my face. I'm clearly been exposed to a serious chemical toxin. It's all over that hotel room that I just came back to. And I just found this bottle under a tree, and I'm wondering if you could take it and do some testing on it to see what's in it. And so they went and got the hotel manager, and he's like, oh, no, it's just some harmless fertilizer, nothing to worry about. And the police are like, well, hotel manager said there's nothing to worry about, guess we're gonna go. And as I turned to walk away, I was like, wait a minute. You can't just walk away without taking that chemical with you. And he said, hey, the hotel managers, it just seems obvious. It's out in the garden, And I said, okay, I dare you, any one of you, to unscrew that bottle and pour some of it on your arm if you're so sure it's safe. And that stopped them. And they all sort of exchanged meaningful looks. And then the biggest, toughest looking guy came over to the bottle, picked it up, unscrewed the nozzle, and as he poured that bottle onto his left arm, this big, tough, strong police officer, his right hand and forearm started shaking violently. And then he quickly said, see, nothing wrong, and then they all turned tail and left without the bottle. So I toughed it out in that hotel room, I think it was for 2 nights, and then I found somebody else to take me in who was also in the mafia and also tried to poison me, and then I fled back to Oregon, where I've been running a gauntlet ever since. 70 different properties have I moved through from between 2014 and 2019. And so I'll tell you the gauntlet of police brutality and abuse in the second part of this story, and I'll leave it off for tonight. Thank you for listening.